Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're really going to get into the nitty-gritty of phase 1 clinical trials.
Oh, yeah. This is where the rubber meets the road in drug development.
We're going to be using medical textbooks, FDA and ICH guidelines, research articles, the whole shebang. We'll examine how researchers identify and manage safety concerns, make adjustments to those trial protocols as they go, and ultimately figure out if a drug is safe enough and effective enough to keep moving forward.
And it's really a dynamic process.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's dive into a real-world example. Imagine a new drug, and this drug is meant to treat a neurological condition.
Okay.
We're not going to name any specific companies or drugs, of course.
Right.
But let's say this is something that affects movement and coordination. This phase 1 trial, it's focused on safety and figuring out the right dose. Those are like the first critical steps in figuring out how this drug works in people.
Mm.
And what's really interesting here is that they're using an oral dosage form, basically, a pill.
Interesting.
And as we all know, pills, they're not always as simple as they seem.
Oh, you're telling me. Sometimes those things are like horse pills, you know?
Right. So true.
So from that moment when you swallow the pill to the drug actually making its way to the brain where it needs to do its job, it's a pretty amazing journey.
It is a complex process. You got to think about the drug dissolving, then getting absorbed through the digestive system, then it goes through the liver and gets broken down, and finally, hopefully enough, it reaches the brain. That's where a lot of those early challenges can pop up in phase 1 trials.
So let's talk about some of those early hurdles in this specific trial. What kind of safety signals did they encounter?
Well, when they looked at the participants in the higher dose groups, they saw some gastrointestinal problems cropping up.
Oh, no.
Yeah, things like nausea, vomiting, the not so fun stuff. And this wasn't something they really expected based on the preclinical studies they had done in animals.
So it was a surprise. Kind of a curveball, yeah. And on top of that, they noticed some liver enzyme elevations in a few folks, which could indicate some liver stress. Understandably, these findings definitely raised some red flags about the drug safety profile.
So they hit some snags. Did the research team just abandon the whole trial at that point?
No, not quite. They decided to temporarily pause enrollment in those higher dose groups while they investigated those safety signals further. They dug deep into the data, got some expert opinions from toxicologists and gastroenterologists, and looked to those FDA and ICH guidelines for guidance on how to handle situations like this.
So those guidelines are pretty crucial in these kinds of situations, huh?
Oh, absolutely. They provide a really important framework for making responsible, ethical decisions in drug development.
Makes sense.
They stress how important it is to monitor those safety signals carefully during these early trials, especially when you encounter unexpected events. And they offer some guidance on how to adapt and change that trial protocol to minimize the risks moving forward. It's about finding that balance between learning as much as we can about the drug and keeping those participants safe.
It's a tough job. So how did they end up modifying this particular trial to address the safety concerns?
Well, first off, they lowered the highest dose they were testing. It's a pretty standard approach, to try and reduce how severe those side effects are. Then they decided to monitor everyone in the trial more closely, especially their liver function, just to keep a really close eye on things. And lastly, they implemented stricter criteria for who could participate in the trial. They wanted to make sure that anyone with pre-existing liver issues or taking medications that might interact with this new drug, they wouldn't be included.
So they had a multi-pronged approach, trying to mitigate the risks from different angles.
Hmm.
And it really highlights how flexible and adaptable these trial protocols can be. It's not a simple straight line from the lab to the pharmacy. It's a winding path, and there's constant learning and adjustments happening all along the way.
Absolutely. Every stage, especially those early phase 1 trials, can reveal new insights that might require the researchers to reassess their plans and adjust the course as they go. Drug development, it's a journey of constant discovery and refinement.
Now, I know you mentioned those FDA and ICH guidelines, and I'm curious, have there been other cases, maybe from other phase 1 trials, where researchers have run into similar challenges and relied on those guidelines to figure out their next steps?
Absolutely. There are tons of examples. One that comes to mind is a trial for a new anti-cancer drug. They encountered some unexpected cardiovascular effects in a few of the participants.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it wasn't immediately clear why those effects were happening, so they had to really dig deep into the data, look into those potential mechanisms, and consult the regulatory guidelines to make sure they were proceeding in the safest way possible.
So how did it play out in that case? Were they able to continue the trial?
Yes, they were able to continue. After a very thorough review and they consulted with cardiologists, they decided to put in place much stricter cardiac monitoring during the trial. They also changed the way they were increasing the dosage, slowing down the pace to make sure they weren't increasing it too quickly, and they excluded anyone who already had heart problems from participating. So, by making those adjustments, they were able to keep learning about the drug's effects while also prioritizing the safety of the participants.
It sounds like a tightrope walk, trying to balance that need to move forward with the absolute priority of protecting the people in the trial.
Such a good analogy, because you're right, it's not just about tweaking some numbers, it's about understanding the science behind the drug, understanding why those unexpected events happen, and using that knowledge to make better decisions. It really is a detective story.
And those guidelines, like the ones from the FDA and the ICH, act as a sort of guidebook,
They do, right?
a roadmap to help researchers navigate tricky situations and make those informed decisions that prioritize both safety and scientific progress.
They provide a framework.
Okay, so safety is obviously the top priority.
Hmm.
What other key lessons can we learn from our case study and those real-world examples we've talked about? What are some of the big takeaways about how phase 1 trials actually work in practice?
I think the most important lesson is that managing safety signals is paramount.
Yeah.
It's absolutely crucial. Researchers have to be incredibly vigilant. They need to be on the lookout for any unexpected events, and they need to have those clear procedures in place for how to investigate those signals and how to make those data-driven adjustments to the protocol to address them.
So it's like having a really sophisticated radar system that's constantly scanning for any blips on the screen that can indicate a problem.
Exactly.
And that radar system needs to be connected to a team that can react swiftly and decisively.
They do, yeah, because sometimes those early signs can be very subtle. They can be almost like whispers in the data.
It takes a skilled team to pick up on those whispers and interpret them correctly.
It does. And the FDA and ICH guidelines, they actually give researchers a blueprint for how to build and operate that safety radar system. They want to make sure it's as sensitive and effective as possible.
Right, so safety is paramount. But what are some other key lessons that emerge from this deep dive?
Well, I think another really important takeaway is that drug development, it's an iterative process.
It's not always a straight line.
Definitely not a straight line. It's full of twists and turns. Phase 1 trials, they're all about learning. And sometimes the most valuable insights come from those unexpected challenges and those adjustments that you have to make along the way.
It's like those early explorers venturing into uncharted territory. They set out with a plan, but they have to be ready to adjust and adapt based on what they find along the way.
Absolutely. Those adjustments made in phase 1, they can ripple through the entire process. It can inform how later trials are designed, and it can even shape what the final drug product looks like when it actually reaches patients. It's a continuous journey of refinement.
Now, remember that interesting tidbit we talked about earlier about swallowing a pill?
Mm-hmm.
How that's not always as simple as it seems.
Oh, yes, bioavailability.
Yeah.
That's such a great example of how even simple things like swallowing a pill can have hidden layers of complexity.
It's true. So let's bring it down for our listeners.
Mhm.
What exactly is bioavailability, and why is it such a big deal in drug development?
So bioavailability is the proportion of a drug that actually gets into your bloodstream after you take it, and the part that's actually able to have an effect.
It makes sense.
It's not just about how much drug is in that pill, it's about how much of it actually gets to where it needs to go in the body, and how much of it is in the right form to do its job.
So it's not just about getting it in, it's about getting it to the right place in the right way, like sending a tiny package on a really complicated delivery route.
Such a good way to put it. And for pills, for oral medications, it's kind of an obstacle course. You have to think about that pill going through the acidic environment of the stomach, getting absorbed through the intestinal wall, getting past those metabolic processes in the liver, and finally making its way into the bloodstream to reach its target. And at each of those steps, there are things that can affect how much of the drug actually gets to where it's supposed to go.
And bioavailability, that's something that those researchers are constantly wrestling with, right? Especially in those early phase 1 trials where they're trying to figure out how much of the drug to give and how to give it to get the desired effect without causing harm.
Absolutely. It's a key consideration in these trials. And those regulatory guidelines, those ones from the FDA and ICH we talked about, offer recommendations on how to measure and evaluate it. They stress the importance of comparing different formulations of a drug. That way, researchers can make sure that the one they ultimately choose delivers the drug effectively and consistently.
So those scientists are like master engineers, fine-tuning that delivery system to ensure that the package arrives at its destination intact and ready to do its job.
That's a perfect analogy. And that attention to detail, especially in those early trials, can really make the difference in whether a drug ultimately succeeds or fails in helping patients.
Okay, so bioavailability is key. In our case study, how did the researchers actually deal with bioavailability? Did they have to make any adjustments based on what they learned?
Remember those gastrointestinal issues that some of the participants experienced?
Yeah.
Well, those issues could be connected to bioavailability.
Really? How so?
If the pill's not releasing the drug properly in the digestive system, you might end up with a higher concentration of the drug in the stomach. That can lead to irritation.
That makes sense.
Or if the drug is absorbed too quickly, it can overwhelm the liver. The liver's trying to process it all at once, and that could lead to those elevated liver enzymes we talked about earlier.
So it's not just about the total amount of drug. It's about when and where it's absorbed. It's like ensuring that a package not only arrives at the right address, but also at the right time.
Perfect analogy. So, based on what they found, those researchers started looking into different pill formulations. They wanted to see if they could control the release of the drug, maybe by using a special coating or adding some ingredients that would help it get absorbed a little more smoothly.
So they were engineering those pills to deliver the drug in a more predictable and targeted way, almost like those time-release capsules you see.
That's a great way to think about it. Those adjustments, all based on that bioavailability data, could really be crucial in ensuring the drug is both effective and safe. It's about getting that balance right, delivering enough of the drug to work, but not so much that it causes problems.
It's a lot to juggle.
It is. It is. It's amazing what we can learn from these early trials. It's not just about a drug in isolation, it's about understanding human biology. How these drugs interact with our bodies, it's so complex.
Each trial is like a mini experiment, adding to that body of knowledge about how to create safer and more effective medicines in the future.
And when you look at the big picture, it's not just about getting that drug to market as quickly as possible, it's about getting it right. And sometimes that means taking the time to understand the nuances, even if you have to adjust things as you go.
You've mentioned those regulatory guidelines before, and I know they play a huge part in those decisions during a phase 1 trial, especially when safety signals pop up.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how those guidelines, like the ones from the FDA and ICH, actually work in practice?
Sure. They basically provide this framework for conducting research ethically and with scientific rigor. You can think of them as a set of guardrails helping researchers navigate this complex landscape of drug development. And specifically, when it comes to managing those safety signals, these guidelines offer a really structured approach. It helps them identify, assess, and mitigate the potential risks, like having a roadmap, especially in phase 1, because in phase 1, you're often seeing those effects in humans for the very first time.
So they're not just like abstract rule, they're actually guiding those decisions in real-world trials like the one we're talking about today.
Exactly. Remember those liver enzyme elevations we discussed? Well, those ICH guidelines, they directly address how to monitor and manage potential liver injury caused by a drug. They make recommendations about which liver function tests should be done, how often they should be done, and the criteria for saying, okay, we need to adjust the dose or we need to stop the trial based on what those tests show.
So those guidelines help those researchers in our case study decide how often are we going to check those liver function tests? And at what point do we say, okay, this is a serious red flag, something's not right here?
Exactly. They provide that data-driven framework to make those really crucial decisions, helping to find that balance between learning about the drug and keeping patients safe. And they're constantly evolving too. New knowledge is always coming out, and those guidelines are updated to reflect the most recent scientific understanding. It's a really dynamic process.
Okay, that's actually really reassuring to know that those guidelines are in place, like having a safety net for both the participants and the research itself. But it also makes you realize how complex this whole process is. It's not just about having a brilliant idea for a new drug. You have to think about the science, the ethics, and all those regulations.
Oh, for sure. And it's amazing how those guidelines try to find that balance between protecting patients and encouraging innovation at the same time. They give structure and guidance, but they also allow for flexibility and adaptability. They recognize that every drug is different and every trial is unique.
Okay, back to bioavailability for a moment. How do those guidelines influence how researchers approach and assess bioavailability in a phase 1 trial? We know why it's important, but how do they actually measure it? How do they make sure enough of that drug is reaching its target?
Yeah, so bioavailability, it's definitely a key consideration in those early trials. And regulatory guidelines offer specific recommendations for how to measure and evaluate it. For example, the FDA, They emphasize doing studies to compare different versions of a drug, different formulations. They want to make sure that the formulation they pick delivers the drug effectively and consistently. And they might even compare how the drug is absorbed when you take it orally versus intravenously, which skips all those absorption hurdles. That way, they can get a good idea of how much of the drug is lost when you take it by mouth.
Ah, so it's like comparing how much water makes it through a leaky pipe versus a direct flow.
Exactly.
Okay. So those guidelines would have helped the researchers in our case study determine whether those changes to the pill design actually improve the bioavailability, right? Like a quality control check.
Exactly. They provide that framework for doing those comparative studies and for making sure that data is reliable and can be used to make decisions about how the drug is developed moving forward.
Makes sense. We've talked about the science and the regulations, but I think it's important not to lose sight of the human side of things.
For sure.
Given all those uncertainties, all those unexpected events, how do those ethical considerations guide the decisions made by researchers and regulators?
Yeah, you're bringing up a really crucial point. Ethical considerations, they are absolutely central to every single aspect of clinical research, but they're even more important in phase one when we're really going into uncharted territory. We're asking those healthy volunteers to take on a certain level of risk. They're helping us understand a new drug, and that's a huge responsibility. And informed consent is the foundation. Participants have to be fully informed about those potential risks and benefits, understand that they can withdraw at any time, and really feel confident that their well-being is the top priority.
So it's not just about handing them a form to sign. It's about a true understanding.
Oh, absolutely. It's about making sure they truly understand what they're signing up for and that they're making that decision freely. And informed consent is ongoing throughout the trial. If any new information comes up, like an unexpected side effect, those participants need to be informed and given a chance to decide if they want to continue. It's a constant dialogue between the researchers and participants, all based on transparency and trust.
That makes sense. It's a partnership.
Yeah.
And those ethical considerations, they go beyond just informed consent, too, right? They influence how the entire trial is designed and conducted.
Absolutely. Researchers have an ethical obligation to minimize those risks to participants. They have to carefully think about the rationale for doing the trial in the first place, and they have to be open about their methods and their findings. It's all about conducting the trial in a responsible, ethical way with the utmost respect for those individuals who are volunteering their time and their bodies to help us gain knowledge.
It's a good reminder that behind all of this complexity, all the science and regulations are real people, and they trust us to do this research the right way. Their participation is truly a gift, and we need to honor that.
I couldn't agree more.
Okay, so I want to shift gears a little bit and delve into a specific part of drug development that often comes into play in those early trials. And that's how the drug itself is formulated. We've touched on this a little when we talked about bioavailability. But I want to know more about the work that goes on behind the scenes. How do they turn a raw drug substance into something someone can actually swallow, like a pill?
Formulation, yeah. People don't always talk about it, but it's the unsung hero of drug development. It can have such a huge impact on a drug's success.
It's what makes sure the drug can actually be delivered in a way that's both effective and, something someone can actually take.
Exactly. And in our case study, remember, they were trying different ways to control the drug's release.
Uh-huh.
That's all about formulation. It's about taking that raw ingredient, the active part of the drug, and transforming it into that final drug product that can be safely and effectively given to patients.
So break it down for me a little bit. What exactly is drug formulation, and why does it matter so much? Because we're talking about more than just putting some powder into a capsule, right?
Right. It's so much more than that. It's a really complex process. They have to pick the right inactive ingredients, they're called excipients, to create a stable, easy-to-use dosage form and make sure it has good bioavailability.
Mm-hmm.
You can think about it like building a delivery vehicle. You need to choose the right materials, the right design to make sure the cargo gets to its destination.
Okay, I get it. And those delivery vehicles, they come in lots of different forms, right? Pills, capsules, injections, creams, inhalers.
So many. And each form has its own challenges and considerations.
Right.
In our case study, they were working with an oral form, a pill.
Yep.
And one of the biggest challenges with pills is making sure that the drug dissolves properly once it's in your digestive system. If it doesn't dissolve, it can't be absorbed. The drug won't work. Another challenge is controlling how quickly the drug is released. Some drugs need to be released quickly, and others need to be released slowly over time for a longer lasting effect.
So it's like finding the right balance. Like, is it a sprinter or a marathon runner?
Exactly. And those needs, they can be really different depending on the drug's chemical properties, where it needs to go in the body, and what kind of therapeutic effect you're looking for. Some drugs are absorbed really easily, and others are, I'd say, notoriously finicky.
So those scientists are like detectives, figuring out how to overcome those challenges.
They are. And they have all sorts of tools at their disposal. They can use different coatings to control how the drug dissolves, add things that improve absorption, and they even use special manufacturing techniques to create those pills with very specific release profiles. It's constant innovation.
It almost sounds like one of those cooking shows.
It does.
They have to consider all those factors, the drug's properties, how it needs to be delivered, safety, effectiveness, and of course, what's practical to manufacture. It's pretty amazing how they manage to make it all come together.
It is really amazing. It's a testament to their creativity and their dedication. They really are pushing the boundaries. And in our case study, those formulation adjustments, tweaking how that pill was designed, well, those tweaks were a big part of addressing those safety and bioavailability challenges we talked about earlier.
Right. They were trying to make the drug release more smoothly, so it wouldn't be so hard on the stomach.
Yeah.
And they wanted to assure that more of the drug actually got to where it was needed.
Exactly.
Okay. So I want to bring up something that's often connected to drug development, intellectual property, and patents. How do those things factor into the decisions made during a phase 1 trial, particularly when it comes to how the drug is formulated? Because we're talking about a lot money being invested and potential profits, right?
Absolutely. Intellectual property, it's essential for drug development. It's what motivates companies to invest all those resources needed to bring a new medicine to market. And those patents are essential for protecting those investments. And they're like a reward for all the effort and risk that goes into developing that drug. They give the company exclusive rights to sell that drug for a specific amount of time. That way they can hopefully recoup their research and development costs and maybe make a profit that allows them to keep innovating.
Okay, so the patent part makes sense, but how does that relate to the formulation? They seem like two separate things.
Well, not always. Sometimes companies develop a new formulation that's absolutely crucial for the drug's effectiveness or safety. And that innovation, that new formulation, can be protected with its own patent, completely separate from the patent on the drug itself.
Oh, so it's not just about the drug itself, but also how it's delivered, kind of like having a secret ingredient that makes your dish unique.
That's a great way to put it. And those formulation patents can be really valuable. They extend the company's exclusivity in the market and stop competitors from just copying their product.
So in our case study, do you think any of those adjustments they made to the formulation could be patented?
It's definitely possible. If they came up with a totally new way to control how the drug is released or a way to make it absorb better, that could be protected by a patent. They're not just scientists, they're inventors too.
That's pretty cool.
It is.
Okay, let's talk about how those pills are actually made. We talked about formulation, but what about manufacturing? How does that play into those decisions made during a phase 1 trial, especially those formulation choices?
Manufacturing is often seen as that final step, once the drug has already been developed.
Right.
But its influence actually goes all the way back to those early trials.
I know.
The formulation choices made in phase 1, they have to be scalable. Can you make a lot of it? It's not just about making a pill that works for a small group of people in a trial. It's got to be something that can be produced reliably and consistently for potentially millions of patients.
So it's like having this great recipe at home and then figuring out how to make it work in a huge factory.
That's exactly it. And scaling up, it can be really challenging. You have to choose the right equipment, get all the production steps just right, and have really strict quality control checks at every stage.
So those manufacturing considerations can actually shape the formulation choices back in those early trials.
They really can. If a formulation is too complicated or it needs special equipment that's not readily available, well, then it might not be possible to manufacture it on a large scale.
So they're not just thinking about what works best in the lab, but also what's practical to make.
Exactly.
It's that balance.
It is. It's a delicate dance between those two things.
Okay, so it sounds like a collaborative effort.
Oh, for sure.
Right. The researchers, the people figuring out the formulation, and the manufacturing experts, they all have to work together to make sure that drug can actually go from the lab to the pharmacy shelf.
Exactly. That smooth transition from discovery to delivery is what ultimately allows us to take those breakthroughs and make them real for patients.
Okay, I want to dig a little deeper into a specific part of drug formulation that's so crucial in those early trials, Excipients.
Oh, yes, excipients.
We've mentioned them briefly, but I want to learn more. What are they? How do they affect those early decisions?
Excipients are those unsung heroes. They're the inactive ingredients that are mixed with the active drug substance to create the final product. They might not have a direct effect themselves, but they play a huge role in making sure that drug is safe, effective, and something people can actually take.
So they're like that supporting cast that helps the star shine.
They are. They can do so many things. Help the drug dissolve properly, control its release, keep it stable, even mask its taste or add color and texture.
So with all those different jobs, choosing the right ones must be a big part of the process.
Oh, for sure. It's a delicate balancing act. They have to think about the drug's properties, the form it needs to be in, and how it'll be manufactured. And just like in cooking, using the wrong ingredient can ruin the whole dish.
High stakes.
They are. Choosing the wrong excipient can make the drug less effective, less stable, or even unsafe.
So those choices really matter, especially in phase 1 trials when you're testing a drug in humans for the first time. You want to be sure that those excipients aren't going to cause any problems.
Absolutely. Researchers have to be absolutely positive that those chosen excipients are safe, that they won't mess with how the drug is absorbed or metabolized. And those choices are carefully reviewed. The FDA, for example, has really strict guidelines about the types and amounts of excipients that can be used in drug products. They need lots of testing to make sure those excipients are compatible with the drug and don't pose any safety risks.
So it's like having those food safety inspectors checking every ingredient to make sure that final product is safe to eat.
That's a great way to think about it.
Okay, but back to our case study. How did those adjustments to the formulation and those excipient choices, how did those impact the trial? Did those seemingly small changes actually make a difference?
Oh, they can make a huge difference. Remember those gastrointestinal side effects and those bioavailability concerns? Well, by modifying the formulation and being really careful about which excipients they used, they were able to address those issues. It's like they were tweaking a recipe, trying out different ingredients and methods to get that perfect balance of effectiveness and tolerability.
So fine-tuning that delivery system, so to speak.
Exactly. For example, they might have included some excipients that helped the drug dissolve better in the intestines, and that could reduce stomach irritation. Or they might have used a special coating to make the drug release slowly over time, which could help minimize side effects.
So those little changes to the pill's makeup can have a big impact on how well it works and how safe it is.
Absolutely. And those changes often come from the data from those early trials. It's
Yeah.
all about constantly learning, refining, and using what they learn to create the best possible version of that drug.
It really shows how much goes into making a pill, something that seems so simple.
It does. It's not just the drug itself. It's how it's delivered, what it's made of, and how the patient experiences it.
Which brings us to something that I think is sometimes overlooked in all the excitement of developing a new, life-changing drug,
What's that?
the patient experience. How do those considerations about the patient experience factor into the decisions made during those phase 1 trials, especially when it comes to the formulation? Because I know those early trials are all about safety, dosage, bioavailability, but it seems like how the patient actually experiences the drug is just as important.
You're absolutely right. People are recognizing more and more that considering the patient's perspective right from the beginning can lead to better drug products and ultimately better outcomes. It's not just about developing a drug that works in theory, it's about developing a drug that patients are actually willing and able to take.
So it's about making a user-friendly drug.
Exactly. And formulation is a big part of that. If that pill is too big, hard to swallow, tastes terrible, patients aren't going to take it. Even if it's the most effective treatment out there, think about a child who needs to take a medicine every day but refuses because it tastes bad. Or an elderly patient who struggles to swallow big pills. Those are real problems that can affect how well the treatment works.
So even if you have this scientific breakthrough, those practical challenges can prevent it from being successful.
Exactly. And that's why it's becoming so important to get feedback from patients during the development process, even in those early phase 1 trials.
So they're actually asking those healthy volunteers about their experience taking the drug.
They are. They're using questionnaires and interviews to find out things like, how easy is it to swallow the pill? How does it taste? And are you satisfied with how the drug is given? It's almost like market research.
So they're treating those participants like partners in the process, not just subjects in a trial.
Exactly. And that feedback is really valuable. It can help them make decisions about the formulation. For example, if everyone says it tastes bitter, the researchers can look into ways to mask that taste. If it's hard to swallow, they can try different sizes or shapes.
So little tweaks to the pill can make a big difference in how acceptable it is for patients.
Absolutely. It's not just about making it easier to swallow, but also about making it more likely that people will actually stick with their treatment.
Right, because ultimately it doesn't matter how effective a drug is if people aren't actually taking it.
Exactly. Patient adherence is crucial. A drug sitting unused on a shelf doesn't help anyone.
So it sounds like those scientists are advocates for the patients, trying to create medicines that work well and are easy to take.
I think that's a great way to put it. And that patient-centric approach is becoming more and more important. The goal is to improve people's lives, not just create new molecules in the lab.
Okay, let's go back to our case study one more time. Do you think any of the changes they made to the formulation were based on feedback from the participants?
It's definitely a possibility. Remember those gastrointestinal side effects? Well, if those participants were saying that the drug was causing discomfort or nausea, the researchers might have tried to find a different formulation that was easier on the stomach.
So those patient experiences could have directly led to a better, more tolerable pill. It's like they were responding to customer feedback.
Exactly, and that customer-centric approach is becoming really important in drug development. It's recognizing that the goal is to create medicines that people actually want to take.
Now, I want to talk about something that's often a big challenge, especially for people who have ever tried to swallow a bad tasting pill. Taste masking.
Oh, yeah.
Why is that so important? And how does that play into those decisions during a phase 1 trial?
Taste masking is crucial, especially for anything you take by mouth.
Yeah.
So many drugs, they just taste awful naturally. Bitter, metallic, just unpleasant. And if a pill tastes bad, people aren't going to want to take it, and that can have a huge impact on how well their treatment works.
Like that saying, a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. But it's more than just making it taste good. It's about making sure people will actually take the medicine they need.
That's exactly it. And that's where those scientists have to get creative. They have to find ways to disguise that unpleasant taste. It's like they're culinary magicians, making something that tastes bad into something people can actually tolerate.
So how do they do it? What are some of the tricks?
They have all sorts of techniques. They can add flavors to mask the bitterness, coatings to prevent the drug from hitting your taste buds directly, even sweeteners to make it more palatable. It's all about creating a disguise.
So they have to find that sweet spot where
Yeah.
it's both effective and something people can actually swallow.
Exactly, and that often involves a lot of experimenting. They'll do taste tests with trained panels and also get feedback from real patients. Because taste is subjective, so you need to know what real people think.
So they're using some of the same strategies as those food and beverage companies,
Hmm.
doing focus groups and taste tests to make sure people like it.
Yeah, that feedback is really important. If everyone hates a certain flavor, they can try something else. It's all about making the medication as easy to take as possible.
Okay, back to our case study. Do you think taste masking might have been part of those formulation adjustments?
It's definitely possible. If the drug had a bad taste, those participants would have said something. And that feedback might have led the researchers to try some different taste masking techniques, maybe adding flavorings, coatings, or sweeteners.
So they were listening to those customers, so to speak, and trying to make a product that they would actually like.
Exactly. And that customer-centric approach, it's becoming more and more important in drug development. The goal is to make medicines that are both effective and enjoyable to take.
So we've talked about a lot of factors, but I want to bring up something that often gets overshadowed by the excitement of a new, possibly life-changing drug.
Cost.
Ah, yes, cost.
How do those cost considerations, the reality of how expensive drug development is, how do those things affect the decisions made during a phase 1 trial, especially when it comes to the formulation?
Cost is huge. It can really impact the choices made early on. Developing a new drug is so expensive, and a lot of those costs end up being passed on to patients in the form of high drug prices.
So it's like walking a tightrope.
Yeah.
You're trying to create an effective and innovative drug, but you also want to make sure that it's affordable.
It's a constant balancing act,
Yeah.
and that's often reflected in the formulation decisions made during those early trials. Those researchers and companies have to think about the cost of all those ingredients, the excipients, the manufacturing processes, and even the packaging.
So it's not just about the science, it's also about the business side of things. Exactly. And those commercial considerations can lead to some tough choices. For example, a more complex formulation might make the drug work better, but it might also be more expensive to make.
Right, so they have to weigh those potential benefits against the cost.
They do.
And these conversations about cost, they need to happen early on, not just when the drug is about to go on the market.
Absolutely. Ignoring those cost considerations until the end can cause delays, price increases, and even mean that promising treatments never make it to patients.
So those phase 1 trials are about more than just testing a drug. They're about building a sustainable healthcare system.
That's a great way to put it. We need a healthcare system that balances innovation with affordability.
Okay, one more time, back to our case study. Do you think cost played a role in those adjustments they made to the formulation?
It's very possible. If a certain ingredient or process was really expensive, they might have looked for alternatives. Maybe they chose a formulation that wasn't quite as sophisticated, but that meant the drug would be more affordable.
It's all about those strategic decisions.
It is.
I want to bring up something that I think is really important, but doesn't always get the attention it deserves. The environmental impact of drug manufacturing.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
How do those considerations affect the choices made during a phase 1 trial, especially when it comes to the formulation?
Well, the pharmaceutical industry, like any other, has an impact on the environment, and there's definitely increasing pressure to reduce that impact.
So it's not just about creating effective medicines, it's about doing it responsibly.
Exactly. Thinking about the planet as well as the patients. And that responsibility extends to those formulation decisions made early on. Those scientists are starting to consider the environmental effects of different ingredients, manufacturing processes, and even packaging. It's about looking at the whole life cycle of the drug.
That's interesting. What are some of the specific environmental concerns?
Well, one major concern is the use of hazardous chemicals in manufacturing. Some of those ingredients and solvents can be toxic, or they can persist in the environment, posing a risk to wildlife and even people.
So it's about finding safer alternatives.
Exactly. There's a lot of research going on right now into greener manufacturing processes, using fewer hazardous chemicals, creating less waste, and saving energy. People are demanding products that are both effective and environmentally friendly, and the pharmaceutical industry is starting to listen.
Back to our case study. Do you think those environmental considerations might have played a part in their formulation decisions?
It's definitely possible. If a certain ingredient or process was known to be harmful to the environment, they might have chosen a different, more eco-friendly option, even if it meant a slightly higher cost or a slightly less sophisticated design.
It's about making those choices that benefit both people and the planet.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's talk about another really important piece of the puzzle. Regulatory strategy.
Yeah.
We've discussed the FDA and ICH guidelines, but there's a whole world of regulations that can affect drug development. How do those considerations shape the choices made during a phase 1 trial, especially when it comes to formulation?
Regulatory strategy is so important. It's like playing chess. You have to think several moves ahead to be successful.
Because those regulations can be pretty tricky.
They can. And those considerations, those regulations, need to be part of the plan from the very beginning.
So it's not just about making a drug that works. It's about making a drug that meets all those FDA requirements.
You got it. And those requirements, they can influence everything. From how the trial is designed to the ingredients and how the drug is manufactured, it's a balancing act between scientific progress and following the rules.
So those early trials aren't just about testing the drug. They're also about getting all the data needed to get approval later on.
That's right. Having a good regulatory strategy can save you a lot of time and money. It helps make sure the whole process goes smoothly and efficiently.
Can you give us some examples of how those regulatory considerations might affect the formulation decisions?
Sure. One thing that comes to mind is the choice of excipients.
Those inactive ingredients.
Right. Those regulatory agencies, they have really specific guidelines about which excipients you can use and how much you can use. And they require a lot of testing to make sure they're safe and that they work well with the drug.
So those scientists have to be really careful about what they put in those pills.
They do. And sometimes those regulations can actually limit their options. There might be a certain ingredient that would make the drug work better, but maybe the FDA is concerned about its safety, so they have to find something else.
So it's a team effort, getting those scientists, the regulatory experts, and even the lawyers involved.
It definitely is.
Back to our case study, do you think those regulatory considerations played a role in those formulation adjustments?
Most likely, yes. They would have been thinking about those FDA guidelines when they were choosing those ingredients and figuring out the manufacturing process. They wouldn't want to do anything that could cause problems later on when they're trying to get the drug approved.
So they're not just scientists, they're strategists too.
Exactly. And that strategic thinking is so important in drug development. It can really help speed up the process of getting new treatments to patients.
Yeah, it really does. It takes a lot of foresight and planning.
It does.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about something that's sometimes overlooked in those early stages of drug development: commercial viability.
Okay.
We talked about safety, we've talked about effectiveness, we've talked about regulations, but at the end of the day, these companies are businesses, right?
Yeah, you are.
They need to make sure that those drugs they're developing have a shot at being successful out there in the marketplace.
That's right. Commercial viability is the ultimate test for any new drug. No matter how amazing a treatment might be, if it's not commercially viable, it's probably not going to reach the patients who need it.
So these companies aren't just doing research, they're running businesses.
Hmm.
And they need to make a profit so they can fund more research and development.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that need to make a profit, it can really impact the decisions that are made throughout the whole process, even those related to the formulation.
So those scientists, they're not just thinking about the science, they're also thinking about the market.
They are.
They have to understand how many patients might need the drug,
Mhm.
what other treatments are already out there, and how they're going to price it.
All of those factors. They have to think about all of it. And those commercial considerations, they can definitely influence the formulation choices they make.
So can you give us some specific examples of how those commercial considerations might affect those decisions about formulation?
Sure. Let's say a company is developing a drug for a rare disease.
Okay,
The number of patients who might need that drug could be pretty small, which means the drug's commercial potential might be limited.
makes sense.
In that situation, the company might choose a simpler, less expensive formulation, even if it's a little bit less effective or doesn't have quite as good bioavailability. They're trying to balance creating a treatment that works with making sure it's actually feasible to bring it to market.
So it's about weighing those potential benefits against those financial realities.
Exactly. It's a tricky balance for sure. And those commercial considerations can also affect decisions about things like taste masking, the packaging, even the drug's name. They're trying to make a product that will stand out, get noticed, and that will ultimately benefit both the company and the patients.
So those early phase 1 trials, they're not just about exploring the science. They're also about setting the stage for a successful launch.
Absolutely. And that commercial perspective, it's becoming more and more important. The days of just developing drugs because they're scientifically interesting, those days are pretty much over.
So those scientists have to be business-minded as well as brilliant researchers.
That's right.
Now, let's bring it back to our case study one last time. Do you think those commercial considerations played a role in those formulation adjustments they made?
Probably, yeah. They would have been thinking about the potential market for the drug. Were there other drugs already out there to treat this condition? If so, they might have tried to develop a formulation that offered something extra, maybe better bioavailability, a more convenient dosing schedule, or even just a better taste.
So they were thinking about the marketing as well as the science,
Yeah, exactly.
trying to give their drug the best shot at success.
And those strategic decisions, the ones made early on, they can make all the difference.
This deep dive has been fascinating.
It has.
We've covered so much, from the molecules themselves to the marketplace, all the different factors that go into creating a new drug.
So many pieces of the puzzle.
It's not just about discovery, it's about safety, regulations, patient needs, commercial viability, and so much more.
It's a complex process, but it's also incredibly exciting, pushing the boundaries of what's possible to create treatments that can really make a difference in people's lives.
So what does all of this mean for the future of drug development? What are the key things our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that drug development has to be a holistic endeavor. We can't just focus on the science in isolation. We have to consider all those interconnected factors: the safety, the ethical considerations, the regulations, the patient needs, the commercial aspects, all of it right from the start.
It's like they're conducting a symphony, all these different parts working together.
That's a great analogy. And that's so crucial for developing medicines that are both groundbreaking and actually available to the people who need them. Another key takeaway is adaptability. Our case study shows that unexpected things can happen at any point, and we have to be ready to adjust our approach.
Like navigating a ship through uncharted waters.
Exactly. You need a plan, but you also have to be ready to change course when the winds shift.
So the key is to have a good strategy, but also be flexible.
That's right, that balance is essential.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. Given all the complexities we've talked about today, the ethical concerns, the scientific challenges, the regulatory hurdles, what do you think is the most important ingredient in developing a successful drug?
That's a tough one. There's no easy answer. But I think one crucial ingredient is often overlooked: collaboration.
Teamwork.
Exactly. Drug development is no longer a solitary endeavor. You need scientists, doctors, regulators, manufacturing experts, marketing people, and most importantly, patients all working together.
Like weaving a tapestry.
Yes, bringing all those different threads of knowledge and experience together, and that tapestry, when it's created with care and collaboration, it can become something truly beautiful and beneficial for everyone.
That's a great way to put it. Well, expert speaker, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into phase 1 clinical trials. It's been incredibly insightful.
It's been my pleasure. I always love talking about drug development. It's such a fascinating process.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We've only scratched the surface of this topic, so if you're interested in learning more, check out the show notes for links to the sources we discussed and some other resources.
And remember, every pill you take, every medicine that helps you feel better, it represents a triumph of human ingenuity, collaboration, and perseverance.
That's right. And until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and remember, the world of drug development is full of surprises, challenges, and the potential to truly make a difference in the world.